My name is Alex Carter. I'm 31, and this is the story of how a handful of strangers, a shaky camera, and a stubborn refusal to be small gave me back the thing my father tried to take from me: my sense of worth. If you like honest, messy real life stories, hit subscribe. It helps me keep telling them. I grew up in a split level house on the edge of a rust streaked Midwestern town where the highway hummed like a second heartbeat. My father, Tom Carter, ran a family auto shop 2 blocks from the high school. He was the kind of man who carried his respect in his hands, calloused, honest, practical. My mother, Ellen, taught second grade and made the best pecan pie in the county fair every year. They were proud people in the way small towns teach you to be proud, quietly, with a careful ledger of what mattered and what didn't. From an early age, I felt the pull of a different rhythm. While other kids learned how to tune a carburetor with my father on Saturday mornings, I learned how to frame a shot with a disposable camera. I found storytelling in less linear places, in the way my neighbor Mrs. DeLuca hummed while she mended socks, in the sigh of the river when ice thinned in March, in the way teenagers at the bus stop folded their hands around cheap coffee like it might hold them together. I wasn't interested in fixing engines. I wanted to catch the small mechanics of human life and put them up where people could look at them, think, and maybe feel a little less alone. When I told Dad I wanted to be a filmmaker, he looked at me the way our shop's fluorescent light looked at a rusted fender, impatient and unforgiving. "What kind of work is that?" he asked, hands deep in an oil-stained rag. "You gonna make movies about nothing and call it art? Who pays for that, Alex? Who actually pays to see people's feelings?" He didn't say it meanly, not at first. It was more of a disbelief that settled on his face like a weather report he couldn't account for. It stung, but what hurt worse was the way it cut a thread I didn't know I'd been hanging from. My father's approval had been the map I'd always trusted. Without it, the paths I took began to feel less like choices and more like experiments without a safety net. I tried to make the practical choices people in our town respect. I got a degree in communications, something that smelled halfway between a trade and an art. I worked nights at a printing shop, folding brochures and laminating resumes. I filmed local weddings and christenings, anything that paid. Over time, I built a small client list, a landscaping company that wanted a promotional reel, a church that needed a video of their founder's 80th birthday. Merely surviving felt like a win. My father, though, had a way of turning small triumphs into evidence of my folly. "You spent a week on that landscaping video," he'd say, running a finger over a faded calendar on the fridge. "You could have worked that week at the shop and made real money." When I mentioned a documentary idea, a short about a factory that's been closing and how the workers were finding new ways to live, he shrugged. "People don't care about that. They got bills to pay. You want to make people cry for free? Fine. But don't come ask me for a loan." Those words lodged in me. Sometimes I would lie awake and trace the edges of memory, trying to find the exact moment when my father's pride turned into skepticism. Was it when I missed the family fishing trip to help film a neighborhood play? Was it when I used a portion of college savings on a used camera instead of a truck? Or was it just the inevitable collision between a man whose life was built on turned wrenches and a son who wanted to build worlds out of images and silence? I left for a year after graduation, not because I wanted to run from him, but because staying felt like being corralled into someone else's blueprint. I took a job in a nearby city doing production assistance, sleeping on a friend's couch and learning the brutal, honest parts of film work. I learned how to hold a light for hours without flinching, how to coax a nervous interviewee into telling the thing that mattered, how to carry a camera like it was part of my body. I ate ramen and learned to love bad coffee. The city taught me a lot, humility especially. There were people with real voices, people whose lives the cameras didn't usually visit. I started making short pieces about street musicians, about a woman who ran a free tutoring program out of a laundromat, about a retired firefighter who repaired bicycles for kids. I did these for nothing but the chance to practice and a promise I made to myself that I would always make space for the small stories most people pass by. When I came home 6 months later, Dad didn't ask much about the city. He asked instead about my plans in the way someone asks the weather, not because they're invested but because the answer will determine what gets done next. "Got a steady job yet?" he asked over dinner, rolling a fork through mashed potatoes. "Not steady," I said, "but I've got projects." "Heard that before," he said. He put down his fork and fixed me with a look that could make a man confess. "Listen, Alex, you can keep doing projects, or you can think about getting your feet under you. Marriage, kids, a house, those things don't pay themselves." He was right in the literal sense. They didn't. But it felt like he was offering me a false dichotomy, stability or meaning, and he always made meaning sound like a luxury we couldn't afford. Still, I didn't fold. I kept working on my films, scraping together money for a camera, paying back the nights at the printing shop. A small local festival took notice of one of my shorts about the laundromat tutor. It wasn't a major prize, but it was a nod. A tiny door cracked open. That festival accepted a longer piece I did on the factory, and for the first time I felt like I wasn't talking to an empty room. When the factory documentary started getting attention screenings at regional festivals, a modest review in the state paper, the town's interest was a mixture of pride and discomfort. People liked seeing their stories told, but they also didn't like the things the film implied, that steady jobs were vanishing, that the old bargains of hard work equaling stability had frayed. My father watched the documentary at a screening we arranged at the community center. He came because my mother insisted and because he suspected it might be an opportunity for a free sandwich. He sat in the second row, arms folded, jaw set. When the lights came up, he left before the Q&A. I waited for him outside and saw him leaning against his truck, hands balled into pockets, breathing the night like a man trying to measure his courage. "You made some good shots," he said finally. It was faint praise picking at the edge of an old wound. "Good lighting, people look real." He looked at me long enough that I thought maybe there was something else coming. "But," I asked. He shrugged. "You filmed people losing their jobs. You made it look poetic. That's not what it's like. We lost a paycheck, not a piece of theater." The word poetic in his mouth felt like an accusation, as if the act of slowing something down and looking at it tenderly was a betrayal of practicality. "Maybe so," I said, "but poetry doesn't put food on the table, Dad." "So don't make poetry," he said. "Make something that pays, get hired by a company, film weddings, commercials, something with a check." I tried to explain how making the film was both my work and my way of making sense of things. He listened like someone checking the sound on an old radio, half interested, half skeptical. "Look," he said finally, palms up. "I won't lie, I don't understand your world, but I want you to be able to support yourself. I want that for you." It was almost an olive branch. But the next month he put up a flyer in the shop that read "Help WANTED full-time at Carter's Auto." He handed me a business card and an application. The implication was clear and in a way merciful: "Come work with me, stop starving on principle." I filled out the application and never turned it in. Instead, I doubled down. I took on storytelling jobs even when they paid peanuts. I learned how to craft a grant application, spent nights editing until my eyes throbbed, and began teaching a modest filmmaking workshop at the library for teenagers. The workshop became a sanctuary. I watched kids who'd never stood in front of a camera become actors in their own small productions. There was a kid, Danny, who lived with his grandmother and who rarely spoke. Film loosened him up. He learned to frame a shot, to listen for the spaces between words. Watching him transform felt like watching a quiet, steady miracle. That summer, a local nonprofit hired me to make a promotional piece for a program that helped laid-off workers retrain. It wasn't glamorous, but it had heart. I spent days interviewing men and women who had spent decades at the same factory, whose hands had the same rough calluses as my father's. They told stories I hung onto: the pride of a first paycheck, the sting of a plant closing, the small triumphs of learning a new trade. Among them was a man named Henry Webster, who used to work the line at the factory and now ran a woodworking co-op teaching younger tradespeople how to make a living with their hands. One evening, while editing footage of Henry shaping a maple board, I realized I was making two things at once: the nonprofit piece that would help people and a personal project that spoke to what the factory's closing had done to a town like ours. I combined both, the nonprofit goals with a deeper look at loss and adaptation. I worked until the story felt honest, until it wasn't a jeremiad about economic shifts or a pitying portrait, but a look at the stubborn, human ways people stitch themselves back together. When that piece started finding its way on the internet, things shifted in ways I couldn't have planned. First, it landed on a regional blog, then someone shared it on a larger platform with a caption about community resilience. Views rose slowly, then fast. People commented, not the mean-spirited comments I braced myself for, but messages that said things like, "This is my town, and my dad used to work in that plant." A few larger outlets picked it up, not to lionize me, but because the piece was honest and offered more than a headline could. Recognition is a peculiar thing. It isn't always the sudden red carpet you imagine. Often it's a slow tide that rearranges the sand under your feet. For me, it meant more people hired me to tell similar stories. A nearby university asked me to lecture. A public radio program invited me to speak about making documentaries in small towns. My inbox filled with messages from people who said they'd seen their lives reflected in my work and felt less alone for it. And then one wet morning, my father came into the shop and shut the bay doors behind him in a way that made the chill recede. He'd been listening to a local podcast where they discussed my piece on the factory, and someone had called him, asked if he knew that filmmaker's boy. He didn't tell me about the podcast. He told me about a woman at the diner who had asked if I was the one who made the woodworking story. She said it made her cry, he said, watching me while he wiped his hands on a rag. I could see the wheels turning, so I said. So, he said slowly, people are talking about your stuff not because it's pretty but because it's true. I heard that your piece helped the nonprofit raise more donations. Maybe you're doing something. When he used doing something with the weight it carried in our family, it meant he had recalculated his estimate, but he still couldn't bring himself to be generous. Still, he added, it don't pay like the shop does. I wanted to say then and there that worth wasn't a balance sheet. Instead I said, I know. Months passed, my work continued. An independent film festival asked to screen my most recent documentary, a longer film exploring the lives of 4 families navigating the plant's closure. The festival was out of state, an up-and-comer in the circuit that mattered to a certain crowd. A small grant covered travel and lodging. I took the project, nervous and quiet, as if success still felt like something I might wake up from. The night of the screening, the theater sat full. It was the most people I'd ever seen in one room watching my work. There were question and answer sessions, polite applause, then a small storm when a reviewer from a national outlet wrote a piece that called my film a necessary look at the forgotten labor of America. The phrase national outlet hung in my mind like a bell. My father called me the next morning. I hadn't expected it. His voice was the same but softer, like someone who'd realized his hands had been too tight for too long. Turned on the radio, he mumbled. Heard your names, thought I better call. Dad, I said. Proud of ya, he said it without the old caveats. You made something people listen to, not just around here. Should have been an easy victory lap, but victory felt strange. The attention made me both proud and suddenly exposed. Critics exist in a different currency than local respect. People I didn't know had opinions. My inbox filled with both praise and criticism. There were accusations that my work exploited suffering for clicks, that I manufactured pathos. There were 2 messages from people who said it had changed how they treated their neighbors. The world was messy, success didn't clean it up. It just put more eyes on the mess. And then something happened that tested everything I thought I knew about art and family. A regional news outlet reached out to my father for an interview about small businesses coping with economic changes. They wanted a local perspective, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Dad suggested I come along. Perhaps he wanted to see how I'd handle myself in a context that required steady facts rather than soft images. Perhaps he wanted to show me off like a trophy he didn't know he had. Either way, I went. On live radio, a host asked Dad, what's it like to have your son make a name for himself talking about this town's hardships? Dad, careful with his words as always, said, proud. He paused, then added in a way that made my stomach fall, but sometimes I still wonder who pays for his work. Who actually pays to hear these stories? The statement landed like a slap, but not because of what he said, because I could see in a small, involuntary stall in his face that he didn't entirely mean it as a barb. It was half query, half resentment. The host, sensing friction, laughed too loudly and moved on. The segment ended and we drove home in silence. That night I replayed the moment over and over, not because I needed to be vindicated, but because I wanted to know why his question kept feeling like an indictment. Who did pay? On a technical level, grants and nonprofits paid me a fraction of the cost. Festivals sometimes gave small stipends. Corporations paid more but often asked me to water down the messy bits. But beyond currency, whose lives were being compensated? The people who shared their stories rarely received anything beyond a screening invitation. I wrestled with this and tried to find an ethical center, a promise to be fairer, to offer stipends when possible, to always get consent and explain intentions. A week later, a letter arrived at my parents' house. It was from a woman named Rebecca Hargrove, a reporter who'd read one of the profiles published after the festival. She wanted to produce a web piece that looked at the broader impact of telling local stories and featured several filmmakers working in small towns. She asked if she could interview me and a few of the subjects in my films. The interviews were straightforward, mostly about craft and intention. Rebecca was thorough but humane, and by the end of a long afternoon she proposed something unexpected, a short feature that would pair my film footage with profiles of the people whose lives had been affected. Not just the finished film, she said, but the people behind it, the ones you filmed. It was exactly the sort of follow-through I'd been angling for. I called Henry and a few others and suggested Rebecca speak with them. A week later she called with news. The piece had been funded by a nonprofit committed to storytelling ethics, and there would be a small stipend for each person who participated. When I told my father, he was quiet for a while. Well, he said, that's good, that's fair. That word, fair, was what I wanted. We had negotiated imperfectly a way of telling stories that was not extractive. The public attention was no longer just about me, it was, in part, about giving back. Time moved like that in small reconciliations and sudden reckonings. My work grew. I was able to hire an assistant, then a small crew. I began paying contributors and offering longer-term collaborations instead of one-off interviews. The town's relationship with my films changed. Some people still thought I romanticized hardship. Others believed I kept a mirror to the world they lived in. One winter evening, when the snow was thin and the lights at the shop burned like little beacons, my father and I sat at the kitchen table with mugs of something hot and too sweet. He had the radio on low. The house smelled like toast and old paper. He looked at me across the table, and for the first time in a long time it seemed like the map of our lives was being redrawn in pen rather than pencil. "You always been stubborn," he said. "Maybe not the kind of stubborn that gets you greenbacks right away, but you stick at something, that's something." I laughed, a small sound that held too much, thanks. "There's one thing I don't get," he said. "You put people on film, you make them part of stories. What do you want from them? What do you owe them?" The question wasn't rhetorical. He was probing. I told him the truth. I wanted honesty, I wanted trust, and I wanted a picture that didn't lie. I wanted, too, to make sure the people I filmed weren't left feeling used. I told him about stipends, about consent forms, about involving people in editing decisions when possible. I told him that sometimes the work cost more than money, it cost time, vulnerability, and that I felt responsible. He listened like a man learning to read a new dialect. "You're trying to do the right thing," he said slowly. "That's more than a lot of folks." "I try," I said, "but I make mistakes." "You always will," he sipped his drink, then quieter, "but I like that you try." It was a small passage, hardly a sweeping reconciliation, but it felt honest. Over the next year we spoke more. He started coming to screenings, sometimes with his cap in his hand, sometimes with a gruff pride that softened into something like warmth. He stopped putting up help wanted signs in the shop's window with my name on them. Instead, he introduced me to customers as my boy the filmmaker, which made my cheeks heat and my heart lurch in ways I wouldn't have expected. The town changed too, slowly, unevenly. New enterprises opened in storefronts that once sold parts. Some people left, others learned new trades. The factory building itself took on a second life as a co-op for small manufacturers, and I filmed the ribbon cutting with hands that had once operated heavy machinery. Henry's woodworking co-op thrived. He started teaching apprentices, and a few former factory workers became instructors. They made things again, their hands steady and practiced, the way hands become when they're trusted to do something meaningful. Not all wounds healed. Some families remained quiet about what they'd lost. Some nights at the shop, my father would stand in the doorway and talk about the regulars who'd stopped coming by. Loss had a long tail, but there was also a new vocabulary in the town, one that included adaptation and small inventions. There was one critical moment that changed my life in a way I couldn't have scripted. A national public broadcasting program contacted me about adapting one of my documentaries into a broader series on American labor shifts. It was an offer that came with both resources and scrutiny, more money to do deeper work, but also the pressure of a larger audience. I accepted, terrified and excited, knowing that the stakes were higher now. We would need contributors, travel, interviews across several states. It was an opportunity to do justice on a wider scale. When the series aired, the response was frankly overwhelming. Viewers wrote in with their own stories. A senator mentioned it in a speech about community investment. An unexpected email came from a nonprofit that partnered with towns to retrain workers and urged me to come speak about ethical storytelling. The show didn't solve policy overnight, but it added one more voice to a larger conversation. For me, it felt like a kind of validation, not the validation my father had initially demanded in the form of a steady paycheck, but something that acknowledged the work had value. My father watched the series in pieces, sometimes in the early morning when he'd get up to open the shop. He'd sit with his coffee and watch people on screens, and later call me to ask about how certain things were made or what certain interviews were like. He asked questions I hadn't heard from him before, not because he was trying to make conversation, but because he genuinely wanted to understand. One afternoon after a screening at a university, an older woman approached me. She was small and quick, her hair silver, and she took my hands in both of hers. "You filmed my town," she said simply. "You made it matter." "Martha," I said, surprised. She'd been one of the people in one of my earlier shorts, a woman who ran a local diner and kept everyone fed during the plant's dark months. "Yes," she smiled, and there was a quick, wry light in her eyes. You know, your dad was right in one way. He wondered who paid for your work. I want you to know we paid you in trust. We lent you our stories and we asked you to be kind with them. You kept that promise. I felt a pressure in my chest, a kind of gravity. I thought of all the small agreements I'd made with people, to be transparent about my intentions, to share profits when possible, to make sure people were represented in ways they consented to. I hadn't been perfect, but I had tried. Hearing it recognized was a quiet coronation. Years later, I watched my father slow in ways I hadn't expected. The shop's nights lengthened with the quiet of an economy that had left fewer cars in the bays. He began to tire more quickly. There were health scares that flicked through the family like bad weather. Sitting by him in hospital waiting rooms, watching monitors click and patients shift, I thought of how wound up we all get in the things that feel concrete: jobs, bills, schedules, and how fragile those things can be. One late autumn evening, when the leaves were dust and gold, I came home to find my father at his workbench, polishing a prototype of something he'd been tinkering on for years, a small device to make a certain mechanical task easier. He looked up when I came in. "You always asked me who pays for your work," he said. "I've been thinking about that. Maybe I'm the idiot, maybe a lot of people are idiots, but I see what you do now. You make the town a little easier to see." He paused, then smiled in the way his mouth always did when he saved something kind for the end. "And listen, if you're ever short, the shop's always got a job, but you don't have to take it unless you want to." I laughed, and the sound in the kitchen was both small and enough. "I know," I said, "and thanks." It wasn't the grand speech of a movie. It was the way our lives had crept toward a kind of mutual understanding, battered by times but ultimately honest. My father never stopped needing the security that came from steady work. I never stopped needing to make art that reached people. We were two people who loved each other imperfectly, and that love made room for both needs. When I teach now at the local community college and at workshops, I always begin by saying that storytelling is an exercise in humility. You go into someone's life and hold up a mirror and hope the image is one they're willing to see. You owe them clarity and fairness. You should compensate them when possible. You should never take the dignity of their story for granted. I tell the students about the nights I slept on couches, about the festivals where no one clapped, about the small victories that felt like air after long dives. I tell them about my father, who believed that work must be measured in dollars to be respected, and about the slow recalculation that followed. I tell them about the lives that let me in and how those lives taught me about stubbornness, about grace. If there is a lesson in all this, it isn't a tidy moral you can print on a bumper sticker. It's more complicated and probably more useful. That worth is not only measured by immediate utility, that art can be labor too, that families can disagree and still learn to respect each other's labor, and that when you tell someone's story, you have to be ready to make them part of the outcome. In the end, my work didn't make our town richer in the ledger sense, but it made certain connections visible: the way neighbors helped each other when the freight stopped coming, the secret barter systems that had always kept people afloat, the new trades that arrived like slow sunrise. My father and I never stopped arguing. We still snap sometimes, the way people do who have known each other for too long. But when he comes to a screening now, almost always he takes a seat in the back, folds his arms, and listens. Sometimes his jaw is set, sometimes his mouth tugs into something soft. After the lights come up, he'll wait for me at the door with a hug that feels awkward but sincere. On the last night of the festival that showed my series, we drove home together with the windows down and the highway breathing around us. I glanced at him as we passed a string of lights that marked the edge of town. He looked content in a way I hadn't seen in years, not because success had come, but because he'd found the language to tell me he understood, even if he still kept his practical compass on the table. "Proud of you, son," he said, as if he'd been practicing the phrase. "Thanks, Dad," I said. And that, oddly enough, was enough. It wasn't a full circle or a fairy tale fix. It was two people who had taken different roads, who had collided and fractured, and through stubbornness and conversation had reassembled something honest. I kept filming and he kept fixing cars, and sometimes we swapped roles. He'd show up to help lug equipment, or I'd lend him an arm when the shop's heater failed in the dead of winter. If there's a final thing I can tell you, it's this: when someone you love doubts the path you're on, it hurts. You can let that doubt become a prison, or you can let it be the hammer that tempers your resolve. Work, honest work of any kind, deserves respect. So does the courage it takes to keep doing it when your own father says it's a joke. I didn't want him to approve because I needed him to like my choices. I wanted him to see my life as worthy of his respect. That took time. It required humility on both sides, willingness to learn new languages, and the small, stubborn steps of doing the work well and ethically long enough that the results spoke louder than the doubts. Family should be about more than control. It should be about trust and the messy, patient work of respecting each other's labor, even when that labor doesn't look like what we were taught to value. That's what I learned slowly with a camera strapped to my shoulder and my father's merciless, ultimately tender, questions in my ears.